President Uhuru Kenyatta and opposition leader Raila Odinga to meet so that they can, give them the report so that the details of this report can be relayed to the public. But even before this is done, we've seen a lot of political reactions, politicians divided on what the BBI report entails even before they see the content. So what does it really mean for the country? What is delaying the release of this report? Let us now speak to Muthomi Thiankolu, who's a lawyer and also an expert when it comes to constitutional matters. He is with me rather here in our studio just to try and dissect what this means. And Mr. Thiankolu, what do you think is the reason as to why there's a delay in the release of this report 16 days later after the team that was collecting opinions from Kenyans indicated that they were ready to hand over the report to the two leaders?
There are many reasons, Brad, why the delay would occur. And because I'm not a member of that team, I can only speculate. One of them is that maybe the report makes very radical proposals that are giving the owners of the initiative, that is the former Prime Minister and the President and their handlers, perhaps second thoughts whether these are exactly what they wanted in the first place. Of course, recently the country has been a bit too polarized from the events in Kibra and the elections. That could be another reason maybe for delaying this. It may well be that the reasons are purely bureaucratic. The president is a very busy person. I want to imagine even the prime minister is a fairly busy person. And therefore, it doesn't follow that these are people who would just drop a report on their desk and within their diary, they can quickly launch it. So for me, the only problem is the more people delay, the more this report is delayed, the more you bring insinuations and speculations such as those we are now making, because I must insist, even what I'm saying is speculation. The only people who might know exactly why it is delayed, the Prime Minister and the President. Yeah.
All right. And, as we speak, I mean, the team, the BBI team had, members drawn from the president's side and others drawn from, the ODM side, Raila's side. And my question is there a possibility that probably the delay might be because the two leaders somehow have, information from their team members of what this entails, so they're still trying to look at the controversial parts of this report? Not that I know about the contents, but I'm just assuming.
That's also a possibility. It may well be, remember this whole thing was about addressing the systemic problems. If we go back in history, BBI was formed after a very bitterly contested election, and then there was the handshake. And the mandate of that technical team, if my memory serves me right, was to explore a permanent solution to this problem of strong feelings of exclusion, the problem of violence being a characteristic of our elections, the problem of the tribe being the base for mobilizing the electorate instead of issues affecting the country. And it may well be, as you say, that maybe even the principles themselves, what Raila Odinga hoped to achieve through this process, is very different from what Uhuru Kenyatta had hoped to achieve. And I think, assuming that is the problem, then the challenge for the two of them is the potential embarrassment, because they have led on the country into thinking that there is goodwill, at least as between the two of them, to get to the bottom of those historical and systemic issues. But, there is politics, and it's always about interests. If the Raila members of the BBI team and the Uhuru members of the BBI team had a very different vision, very different ideas on how to address their mandate, then it may well be that the reason it is delayed is actually because the two principals do not agree on some of the fundamental proposals of that report, or the team itself. It may well be that the technical team itself has internal divisions, and therefore some of its members, depending, assuming the hypothesis is the one we propose, have not even signed on that report because that is not what their principal told them was his interest in this process.
All right, and let's look at probably what are some of the contentious areas that could be of interest to Kenyans, because I mean, even when the president and ODM leader Raila Odinga stood on at the doorsteps of Harambee House shaking their hands, they're saying they do not want to see, violence after every electioneering period. And so at the end of it, the team was formed. But what are some of the contentious areas that Kenyans would really like to see from this report?
The assumption has been that if the BBI, at least theoretically, were to achieve its mandate, then it would be necessary to do some sort of constitutional changes. And one of those that would be very sensitive to political players is, of course, things like the system of government. The 20 Constitution came with a presidential system of government. Previously, we had a system of government that had elements of both a presidential and a parliamentary system of government. Academics will tell you that for multi-ethnic and heavily divided countries like Kenya, the best system of government is a parliamentary system, whereby it is the political party that has a majority of members in the National Assembly that forms the government, where the head of government, usually called the prime minister in that type of system, is drawn from parliament. Cabinet secretaries are drawn from parliament. And the problem we have had historically in Kenya, actually when we got independence in 1963, we had a parliamentary system of government. Many people do not know that. Because of the same problems that I've learned to this BBI of ethnic suspicions and ethnic mobilization and whatnot, in those days the concern was the big tribes would dominate over the small tribes. In those days, the big tribes were the Kikuyus, the Luos, and then the Kalejins and the Maasais. In those days, the demographics have changed a lot these days. It's not the same calculation. But then when you had Kanu and Kandu in the 60s, the politics was how do we ensure that the big tribes do not have more than a fair share of the national resources, more than a fair share of their voice in policy formulation and whatnot. And Kanu, which is the one that prevailed in those fights in the 60s, had always been very suspicious of a parliamentary system. And for obvious reasons, a parliamentary system will eliminate this idea that because you have a big tribe, because you have very big population, therefore you necessarily have a bigger say in the affairs of state.
All right. So
from a purely political point of view, therefore, it is not too hard to see why the people who have held the instruments of state in Kenya since 1963 have always been very suspicious of a parliamentary system of government.
All right. So if assume Kenyans are looking at it like, okay, probably they would want the BBI report to take the country to a parliamentary system, will this necessitate probably a referendum?
It
would.
Because
it means changing some parts of the constitution.
The answer is yes and no. Yes, to the extent that that would be a fundamental change in the structure of government. And in constitutional theory, when you do such a major change in the structure of the government, then the people who own the sovereign power, who is the citizens, must have a say on it. At least that's the prevailing legal position in Kenya based on previous disputes from the Joya case and whatnot. The answer is no, to the extent that what you need, as long as you guarantee a smooth exit of the current regime in 2022, then that other system could, you could change the constitution with an effective date of that time. But for me, what I find curious is that everyone assumes that it's obvious that BBI must lead to a referendum and that BBI must lead to constitutional changes. The truth of the matter is that if you went to the original mandate of the BBI, which was to address the feelings of exclusion and the cycles of violence that characterize our country and whatnot, these are things that can be addressed without constitutional change. But more importantly, if we take it, because everyone seems to take it as for granted that there must be a constitutional change, for me as a lawyer, my interest would be that we have had the experiment of this constitution for close to 10 years now. Certain parts of it have worked well. Certain parts have not worked according to expectation. Now, the problem is when the politicians are the ones driving the process, some of the things that may be of interest to them may not necessarily be the things that should actually be of interest to the entire collectivity of citizens. Because the politicians is about power. Power comes, and the systems of government comes with the opportunity to control resources, to exercise patronage and whatnot. But that's a very small aspect of what constitutionalism and the constitutional systems are about. Yes.
Because the BBI team was a matter of getting, you know, let me say opinions from Kenyans, you know, their sentiments on how to have an all-inclusive, you know, system of governance. Then how are we going to have an inclusive, an all-inclusive Kenyan if we don't go through, you know, a referendum way? Because assume, I'm not saying, and just to put as a disclaimer to our viewers, my sentiments are not an indication of what has been entailed in that BBI report, because I've not yet seen it, we've not yet seen it. But assume the report says that we need to have a rotational system of governance when it comes to the position of the head of state, such that every region is well represented, and it will be like it's a one-term, you know, seat for the person who's leading. So how are we going to have an all-inclusive Kenyan if we don't probably go through a constitutional change, which will necessitate, you know, a referendum?
The answer is yes and no. Yes, to the extent that if you want a fundamental change in the structure and nature of government, then it is obvious you need to refer that question to the people in a referendum. The answer is no, to the extent that the reason we found ourselves in the problems that inspired the handshake and the BBI has very little to do with the system of government we had. It had everything to do with the type of politics that we had, which is politics of exclusion. The only thing the law can do about this, for instance, if you are appointing parastatal heads, you do not need a referendum and a change of the constitution to tell you in a country with 45 tribes, if a third of them come from one or two tribes, as has largely been the case under the Jubilee, that's not a problem of the law. It's simply a problem of people engaging in bad politics. If you have a family of, if we may use the examples from the social setup, you have a family and you have 3, 4, 5 wives, but you only take the children of one wife to the best schools, they are the only ones you take shopping, there is going to be problems in that family.
So are you saying that, you know, what necessitated the handshake are not constitutional problems, but the political problems?
They are largely political. There is a sense in which they are also constitutional and legal. And to that extent, then there is a case for tweaking the constitution. For instance, our constitutional and our electoral system is one in which the winner takes everything. They call it first past the post. So you have a situation like we have always had. You have a guy who is declared president by a margin of 2%. You have another person who got 45% of the vote. Is a nobody. You have this system that creates an incentive because it is first past the post to win by whatever means necessary. If you had a parliamentary system or a proportional representation system and whatnot, even the political players would be compelled by the structure of the legal system to know even the vote from that small tribe that has just very few voters matters. And to me, that is the only extent to which a constitutional change would be necessary. But then, besides these political changes, for me, what has been lost as a lawyer is those small but very important technical aspects of the constitution that we know have not worked very well, which affect the wananchi every day. Yet nobody is talking about them because they are not about power and political mobilization. I'll give you an example. We created 3 courts 2 extra courts with the status of the High Court. If you go to our courts today, nothing is moving at the Land and Environment Court because we have too many land cases. This court has the same status as the High Court, but the High Court judge cannot mention the case because the other judge is sick, because he has no jurisdiction. You have an Employment and Labor Relations Court that has the same status as the High Court, but nothing can move. You have prisoners who have been brought to court for a mention of their case because the judicial officer is sick, and there is one just next door, except that his court is styled differently, although it has the same status. Nothing is happening. Those are some of the small things, in my view, that are in our constitution that have not worked very well. We have a chapter 6 that remains largely on paper, honored more in breach, yet it is maybe the most important chapter that had been envisioned to change our way of handling public affairs. This is not a focus of BBI. You see, BBI is about the politics.
But then how, Mr. Ntiankolu, then how do we, I really don't want to preempt what is going to be put in the report because I've not seen it once again, as I said earlier. But then how will the country, and especially President Uhuru Kenyatta, because he's the president of this beautiful land, Kenya, how will he ensure that the BBI report, if he receives it and reads it and supports it, is implemented without asking Kenyans to support the BBI recommendation through a referendum?
It depends on what changes the BBI report is making. Remember, we are speculating if the sort of changes it requires are not those that require a referendum. You don't require a referendum, for instance, to decide that going forward, there are parts of this country we have treated as if they are second-rate citizens. There is no good road across 3 counties. There is not a good hospital or a good school across an entire region. Child mortality rates because of these exclusions, and the historical, by the way, going back all the way to the colonial times, you don't require any legal reform to address that sort of problem. So I think we're being presumptuous that BBI must inevitably result in constitutional changes. And for me, my advice, unfortunately, I'm a very small man, my advice would be if we must have a constitutional change because BBI proposals require one, then let's not limit that constitutional change to the very small mandate, because in my view, the mandate of the BBI was very specific and very narrow. Let's then do a thorough audit of the 2010 Constitution. We had said, even when we were enacting it, it was common that there were problematic elements, and they have not worked. So let's do that audit and then ask ourselves, we've had this Constitution. Thankfully, BBI has given a chance to revisit the Constitution. Let's do a proper audit and change everything that needs to be fixed about it.
But then it begs the question, why do you think some political leaders, especially those ones supporting the BBI report, are pushing for a referendum even before
they know the content?
Yes, because they've been talking about this constitution will change. We have to go through a referendum way.
It's because for politicians, you see, their interest is not these broader issues I'm talking about. If say you are in the Tanga team, your biggest worry is whether BBI will change the constitutional system and whether that is attempting to change the rules too late when the players are already on the field and sucking up to begin playing, because then if you're sitting from that side, then that is unfair. It is not, there is no good faith. You don't expect someone seated in that camp to have any good animals or intention or feelings towards BBI. If you're on the other side, and this is how politics works, Uhuru Kenyatta is retiring. I don't know whether Tinga is retiring. Your main concern is going forward, since we do not have control, at least not 100% of what happens post-2022, in the event one of us, the so-called dynasties, is not in charge, then how do we ensure that the system that will be there, if especially it is someone from the other side they appear to be fighting, our long-term interest. And remember, these interests are always about resources, they're about business, they're about power and prestige and whatnot. Then how do you secure them? So I want to imagine that politically speaking, and unfortunately I'm not a politician, those are the broad concerns from the Tanga-Tanga vis-a-vis Kieleweke teams. But my problem with the country leaving those two camps to drive the agenda is that then you lose sight of very many important things that we could use the opportunity of any constitutional change to fix, which would affect you on a more day-to-day basis. I mean, I just saw you hearing a video here of police behaving in the old bad days, old bad manners of the single-party state in spite of this constitution. Those are things that would affect you and I more closely than who is the president of Kenya, or whether the head of state in Kenya is a prime minister or a president, and whatnot. We have this whole problem of runaway corruption. That is affecting you and I in 1,000,001 ways we don't realize. I mean, we are paying very heavy taxes. You're paying through your private pocket for private education, private healthcare. You're now buying huge cars because of the portals. There's so many extra costs the typical citizen is incurring because government, which is taxing him so heavily, is not doing what governments are put in place to do, and the reason for that is corruption.
Right.
But that's not a major plank of the mandate of BBI.
All right. And Mr. Thiankolo, let's bring this conversation to an end. My last question would be, why do you think the Deputy President has been left behind? Not really left behind intentionally, but what my question is, why do you think he's not in support of the BBI? Because he says that we will get the report, read its content, put it before Kenyans, and we'll get the minds of the big and the small fish.
It is not him. I think anyone in his shoes, even me, if I was in his shoes, I'll behave exactly the way he's doing. He's in a position that is just so close to the ultimate office in the land, yet so far away from it. So when you're just about to arrive at your desired ultimate destination, and you hear the driver or the pilot or whoever is in charge wants to change course, it's going to give you jitters. So sometimes I think the Deputy President has been criticized a bit unfairly, because if you're in his position, the political promise was Uhuru yake 10, Raila yake, Ruto yake 10. Now that Uhuru has done his 10, then some of the partners seem no longer very enthusiastic about the deal. And remember, our country has had a long history of these betrayals. So he thought he served as deputy president for 14 years, only to be told at the very last minute, urafiki na uongozi ni tofauti, nyamaza professor. That's what he was told at Kasarani. Daniel Moi himself only became president by, events beyond the control of anyone. The president died and whatnot, but even then there were all these maneuvers, including constitutional changes. There was this group that those days called the Kiambu Mafia, who are trying to change the constitution by hook or crook to stop Daniel Arap Moi from succeeding Jomo Kenyatta. I mean, Kibaki had been vice president for very many years. So Ruto is in a position where all the previous occupants of that office have been shortchanged. And because it appears that he too is being shortchanged, I just don't know how we would expect him then to behave differently. I say even me, if I were in his shoes, I would do perhaps with bigger vigor than, or rather with more vigor than.
Okay, all right, thank you so much, Lawyer Muzomi Thiankolo, talking to us about, the expected release or handover of the BBI report to President Uhuru Kenyatta and ODM leader Raila Odinga. A developing story right there. So all eyes are on those two leaders and the team that was getting views from Kenyans, so we can know the content of this report that has caused a lot of political uproar from what we have been terming as the Tanga-Tanga team and the Kieleweke team, because we've seen a lot of political divisions when it comes to matters BBI report. Taking me to our first commercial break.